wisdom,
prudentia,
justice,
justitia,
temperance,
temperantia,
courage.
fortitudo.
Applying ancient philosophy to modern life, this is the Sunday Stoic.
Welcome to the Sunday Stoic podcast. This is Steve coming to you from Conway, Arkansas. And this week, it is my great pleasure to welcome Robin Waterfield to the podcast. Robin is a classical scholar, translator, and editor. And I must say, when you look up Robin on Amazon.com, a lot of books come up. I was very impressed at your catalog. So welcome to the podcast, Robin.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks for having me.
You're on the show this week to discuss a new work that just came out around 10 days ago, I believe, The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, a book that I think a lot of folks are familiar with, but your text has a little more perhaps to offer than some other works. Could you introduce us to your new work?
Yeah, well, I mean, primarily, of course, it was a new translation. Yes, obviously, it's been translated a lot before, and a couple of times it's been translated rather well before. But basic books, the publisher felt that they could sell a copy of a new translation, and they found me. But they also asked me, and this wasn't my idea, although I leapt at it. This was the way they put the project to me right from the start. They also asked me not just to write an introduction, but also to annotate the text quite heavily. So every page that you open, there's likely to be 2 or 3 notes on it as well, explaining the text. The thing is, it struck me that the text has either been in the hands of completely lay readers, people who are just picking up the book because they've heard of it and because they enjoy it, but they don't know anything about Stoicism. And on the other hand, the book has been in the hands of professional professors of ancient philosophy who write, abstruse and pretty inaccessible stuff about it. So I wanted to kind of mediate between the two and translate again some of the more abstruse stuff into footnotes that everybody could appreciate and understand, and that would hopefully deepen their understanding of the text, particularly of Marcus in his own time. I mean, the Stoic ethics can be lifted out of context and put into practice, easily in the 21st century, as you yourself know, Steve. But that nevertheless, it's useful to see Marcus, I think, writing in his own time as the Emperor of Rome. This was definitely one of the things that attracted him to Stoicism, was he hoped it would be a way for him to become a better person, and in particular, a better emperor.
I'll say on the back, there's a quote from Massimo Pigliucci saying that the introduction alone is worth the price of admission. And I think I agree with Massimo. That was a very well done introduction, both for those new to the philosophy, they don't know what Stoicism is, as well as folks like myself, a layperson who's been reading the Stoics for a few years anyway. It was a very thorough and well done introduction. I really appreciated that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of the things I do. I've also translated quite a lot of Plato, well, over half of Plato's works, some Aristotle, some other philosophers and things like that. And so I've kind of got the hang of introducing ancient Greek philosophy for a lay audience, a non-specialist audience.
So how does one translate? Because this is a fresh translation. What was your source, and how do you go about going from ancient Greek to English? What's that process look like?
Well, the sources are always the same. There are in existence standard texts of all ancient Greek, Latin, etc. authors. And in fact, there are usually several standard texts from different publishers, and you find the one which is reckoned to be the best, make that the basis of your translation. I don't think I've ever done a translation, however. I've got over 30 volumes done now of translations from ancient Greek, and I don't think I've ever done one where I've not change the text slightly. In other words, where I slightly disagree with the standard edition and want to read something else, which I think makes better sense. And then you just sit down and start. But
yeah.
It really helps if you can do it day after day. And I'm luckily in a position where I can do that. I'm supported by my wife, so that she leaves me free to work. I don't have any other responsibilities. I live in the middle of nowhere in Greece. So this was even before lockdown. I was able to sit, day after day and really immerse myself in meditations. And when you do that, you get very intimate with the author. And that's a feeling I like, because, it's usually fairly easy to translate a text. I mean, if you're fluent enough in the two languages involved, it's usually fairly easy to translate a text with accuracy. But it's likely to come out sounding rather stilted, what we call translationese, which isn't the way anybody speaks. So the next thing I always do is I look at a sentence I've written and I say, is that what somebody would say? And then, as a result of this process of getting very intimate with the author, in this case Marcus Aurelius, you ask yourself, okay, so as I say, the process of translating accurately is fairly easy, but the process of feeling that you've not just captured the sense, but also the tone of voice, the nuances, the undercurrents, those sorts of things, that's what's difficult. And that's where I refer to this feeling of intimacy with my author, and I ask myself, would Marcus approve of the way I've done this sentence? And you go through like that. By the time the book is published, there is no sentence in it that hasn't been tweaked a dozen times, or hardly any sentence. So I write something, I rewrite it 4 times straight away. Then I come back in the evening and check my work and rewrite it maybe once or twice more. And then over the months, it goes on and on and on like that. I'm an inveterate tweaker and refiner. It works. I mean, it's a good process. I really enjoy translation. For me, it's a great joy. There's nothing gives me greater pleasure than feeling that I have captured a sentence or a paragraph or a book as a whole. As I say, not just done it accurately, but done it in a way that I feel the original author would approve. It gives me a buzz every time. And I'm so lucky that I can go on and on and on doing this. As I say, I've done 30 volumes already, or 30 plus.
Now, how much education did you have in reading ancient Greek to be able to do this? I know I've talked to some lay Stoics, as it were, who have been thinking about trying to learn to read ancient Greek so they can delve into these works. How long does that? I mean, I know it's going to vary from person to person, but that seems like a lot of work.
Well, I was brought up. I went through a very, very traditional British, what we call public school, i.e., private school education. With the result that I started Latin at the age of 8 and Greek at the age of 10.
Wow.
So, which is very privileged. And most of my peers at school were saying, "Oh, boring, dead languages, get lost," But for some reason, I just took to it. Languages were my thing when I was young, and I just took to it, and just went on and on. And then I did it at university, and then I fell into translating. Wonderful.
That's great. Well, did you have to leave anything out of the text that you thought maybe Marcus didn't actually write and was glued on later as the text went from hand to hand over time?
Yeah, like I say, there's always one or two places or more. Marcus's Greek is quite difficult, so there were quite a few places in this one where I disagreed with the standard editions and read something slightly different. Rarely my own ideas, just other people's readings of a particular sentence. Sure. The most significant bit I omitted was, I think, in book 11, section 3, where there's a mention of the Christians.
Oh yes, I've had talks with my patrons about that line because we were trying to figure out what was going on there during a book discussion.
Yeah. So here he says, how admirable is the soul that's ready at every moment in case it's time for it to be released from the body, ready, that is to say, for extinction, dispersal, or survival. But this state of preparedness must stem from a specific decision, not from mere contrariness. And at this point in the text says, not from mere contrariness, like the Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's the way it's expressed in Greek is ungrammatical. That perhaps on its own isn't enough to condemn it, because Marcus was quite often writing more or less just notes to himself. So he's quite often, grammar gets stretched or compressed or quite a lot in the book. So that might be it. Just didn't read right to me. So I think that was a later insertion. I apologize to all those Christians who would love to have, read such an early reference to. To their religion, but I don't think it's original. I think it was. You see, what you've got to remember is that the people who were the scribes who were copying the way books were published was that you wanted to read a copy of a book, so you asked a scribe to transcribe it from a master copy, and this transcribing was always done within the monasteries. Mm. So it's it makes it quite likely for a reference to Christianity to kind of creep in, even though this one isn't a particularly complimentary reference. But Marcus was, after all, persecuting Christians, or at least Christians were being persecuted in the course of his reign. So
So what I found interesting from your introduction was that realizing that Marcus did not have a formal Stoic school to study in growing up. It was more of tutors and things. There was not a head of the Stoa at the time. I found that to be an interesting tidbit, just because those of us who are influenced by the Stoicism now also, we're we're just trying to learn from what we have access to. But I wanted to ask you, so just putting all of this in context, how did Marcus learn about Stoicism? And then what do you think brought on the writing of this text? And then one last part I'll glue onto that question, and why in Greek?
Okay. How did he come across it? He tells us how he came across it. The first book of Meditations is devoted to him acknowledging his debts to his teachers and family and people who he felt when he was a child helped him along the way. And he thanks one of his teachers, a man called Rusticus, for loaning him his copy of Epictetus's discourses. So that may well have been the very first time Marcus came upon Stoicism as a fairly young child. Epictetus, remember, was the former slave who became the foremost teacher of Stoicism in the generation previous to Marcus. He wasn't around for Marcus himself to study under, although, as Emperor of Rome, he probably wouldn't have had the opportunity. He was able to attend lectures, but I don't think he'd have had time to, devote himself to a whole course of study for 2 years or 3 years or something, however long it might take. So I think that's how he came across it, and he was immediately attracted to it. He was immediately attracted to its austerity, to its severity. I think he felt that chimed with the well, again, I'll use the word austerity, I guess, or the robustness of traditional Roman values. I mean, he was obviously being brought up to be Emperor of Rome. He had to follow the traditional values. And I think he felt that Stoicism chimed with that. Then how did he come to write the book? Well, I think the chief influence on him was the Stoic practice of self-examination, self-admonishment, self-exhortation to do better. This was a practice that was encouraged within Stoicism. It was particularly encouraged by Epictetus. So again, we find Epictetus being probably the main influence on Marcus. A nice historical thing, that, isn't it? I mean, that a former slave should have so much influence over the emperor of Rome. I mean, you've got to understand that the emperor of Rome was the wealthiest and most powerful person in the world
Right.
by a long way. Much more than the Queen of England or the President of the States or China or something at the moment, by a long way, head and shoulders. So a former slave influenced him. So I think he took this practice of self-examination and did it literally. He just wrote down ideas that he liked, short texts that he liked, but above all, he wrote down his own reflections on himself. It's a very, very personal book. It's a very sincere book because he didn't expect anybody else to see it, so there was no reason for him to dissimulate at all. It was to encourage himself to keep on trying daily, minute by minute, hour by hour, to be a better person and a better emperor. And it was his way. He uses a nice phrase. He says, of dyeing his mind, of coloring his mind. So it was a way of coloring his mind with all the Stoic precepts and ideas that he felt were helpful for him and were important. And why in Greek? It is on the surface, it does look like a bit of a puzzle because, I mean, he was Roman, so he spoke Latin, and he'd have been conversing on a day-to-day basis with everybody else around him in Latin. Mm-hmm. You'd have thought that if he was writing just for himself, which he was, then he would have written in Latin. But he used Greek because Greek was still the language of philosophy. There were philosophers writing in Latin. Seneca, a Stoic predecessor of Marcus's, is an important example. But Greek was still kind of the language of philosophy. It was also, in some senses, the language of history writing as well, but more people obviously were writing history in Latin. It was a Stoic text. He was a Stoic, and there's quite a few Stoic technical terms that had arisen within Greek Stoicism that were kind of awkward to translate into Latin. So I think it just came naturally to him to write in Greek. He was more or less bilingual. All educated Romans were more or less bilingual in Greek as well as Latin.
Did Marcus use a lot of that? I know the Stoics were well known for having their own vocabulary or the vocabulary of philosophy. Did Marcus use a lot of those technical terms throughout the Meditations?
He does, but not in a very sort of intrusive or heavy way. Usually in a way that's more or less comprehensible on its own. But obviously, I mean, this is what my footnotes were for. Mm-hmm. I annotate the use of technical terms and explain them. Terms like, impulse and the command center and the guardian spirit within, mm-hmm. and things like that.
So the book's laid out with that the introduction, not an introduction, but the reflections on those who have helped him, mentors to him, his family, and I believe from your introduction, you mentioned that was one of the last bits written.
Almost certainly the last bit written. Whether he or whether it was accident that it ended up being the first book. Possibly accident, because it's at the beginning of the second book that he gives the second and third books a kind of a heading at the beginning, telling us where he was when he wrote them. So I suspect that, and since the first book doesn't have one of those, I suspect it was written later. And also it kind of, when you read it, it's the kind of thing that somebody might think about afterwards. Because it's not as personal. If, as I say, the main purpose of Meditations was for Marcus to reflect for himself, this is less reflecting for himself. This is, as I say, he's acknowledging his debts to his teachers and things like that. Just showing us what wonderful people they are and what a good influence they had on him. So I think it was written. I think everybody thinks it was written more or less last.
Now, I know there's a lot of repetition as you read through the Meditations, where he's reflecting, kind of regurgitating ideas and putting them into different, wording them differently and just working through these ideas. But did you see, as you're working on this, because I'd imagine you get pretty intimate with the text, translating it, do you see different themes in the different notebooks as you go, or do the same themes come up over and over again throughout?
It's pretty much the same themes coming up over and over again throughout, and this is a product, as I say, of the fact that Marcus was trying to dye his mind, color his mind with the important ideas. So he just keeps repeating them, because repeating them is a good way to. It doesn't mean. I mean, when you can read the book from cover to cover, and it doesn't read that repetitiously, because he generally finds new and interesting ways to put the same point. It's rarely exactly the same expression. And so you meet, above all, you meet I think three themes. One of them is anger management. He clearly had a short temper, and he clearly was able to get very quickly irritated by the idiots he was surrounded by, or at least some of them he felt to be idiots, or even knaves. And you often see him struggling to control his temper and say, "Come on," and he finds various ideas to express about anger which show why he should not, fly off the handle. So that's one theme. And then death is another theme. I'm pretty convinced of two things. I think Marcus was consumptive. I think he had chronic tuberculosis. A lot of people did in those days, of course. I mean, a lot of people did up until the 1950s, for heaven's sake, And I think by the time he died, I think he knew he was dying. I judge this at least partly on the fact that the final entry of Book 12 is a perfect entry for someone, written by someone who knows he's dying. So I think he was ill. I think he knew he was dying. And so you get a lot of reflection on death, on how, as the Epicureans would say, it is nothing to us. Mm-hmm. It's not important. It's not to be feared. It's a natural process. It's even to be celebrated, because, as Marcus keeps saying, as a Stoic, he believed that on death, the four elements, earth, water, fire, and air, that make up your body your body and your soul, will separate and go their separate ways, where the universe will then reuse them to make something else, a horse or a tree or something else. And this for Marcus was an important and good process, so he even celebrates death. And the third thing that he comes back to again and again is the paltriness of fame. It's short-lived, it's unimportant, it's given by others, so it doesn't really say anything about yourself. And lest that sound rather vain of Marcus to be constantly worrying about fame, for it to have even been an issue to him in the first place, again, you have to remember that he was the Emperor of Rome. He was bound, his reign was bound to be written up by historians and commented on by his contemporaries and things like that. So fame was a real issue. And fame was a real issue for all noble Romans, whether they were emperor or not. They really wanted their families to stand out, and to stand out for generations. That's what they were striving for. If a man got to be consul, he was pleased as punch on his own behalf, but he was also pleased that his family would have been elevated to consular rank from then on, and would be noted as such. So fame, death, and anger management are the three most recurrent themes, but he touches on everything. And lots of people prefer, because of the repetitiousness of the text in part. I don't want to stress this. It's not, as I said before, it doesn't read as repetitious, but there are these recurrent themes. So some people prefer just to dip into it and, pick up a bit here and pick up a bit there and have it on their bedside table at night or something like that. And it's a good book for that. It's a great book for that.
It is. I have heard some argue that Marcus seems like a grumpy pessimist as he's talking about other people. But of course, from the Stoic practitioner side, I also can see what he's saying as a way to just prepare himself to not fly off the handle when he does inevitably meet individuals that tax his patience. What do you think about that?
I wouldn't perhaps quite say he was a pessimist, because a pessimist sees the worst, doesn't he? So Marcus, as a Stoic, was always trying to see the best. As a Stoic, he believed that every situation he was in had been created by a providential God for himself alone, and for a good reason. And so he was always trying to see the good. But he was melancholic, shall we say? Had that slightly dark-hued aspect to his character, but melancholy in the sense of it's melancholy that gives you a kind of profundity, I think, rather than melancholy that makes you pessimistic. Yeah, chiefly irritated by the people around him, or skeptical of them, and uncertain of the value of the world in general, the things of the world. He certainly wasn't attracted by materialism in any sense. He'd set his goal elsewhere.
You mentioned that every situation was created by divine providence, so everything is happening as it should. I just wanted to ask you about that. The divine or God or gods. That's one thing I've always found interesting about the Stoics. You'll see God, gods, nature, all of that, and trying to parse
The
out
universe.
the universe. Yeah, are these
Yeah.
the same thing? Are these different things in Marcus's view? Do you have any thoughts on that? How he thought of that?
Yeah, they're pretty much the same thing, except, I mean, well, when he says, the universe wills this, or God wills this, or providence wills this, those are all definitely the same thing. But I think there is a difference between God and gods. No, sometimes he says the gods just as a way of saying, the divine in general. But I also get the impression that the gods for him were agents of the singular God. Perhaps a little bit in the way that Christians nowadays see angels as the agents of God. So I think the traditional Greek pantheon, he calls God with a capital G, the single God Zeus, so that's that one. But I think the rest of the gods of the Greek pantheon he was inclining to see them as kind of agents of Zeus, or of the big God, or of the universe, or of the providence, or of
Right. Does Marcus? I can't remember now. I think he writes of the logos also, doesn't he? Is the logos come up in Marcus?
Yes, it's because that it's a terribly difficult word to translate in Greek because it has so many different meanings. But yeah, he's using it chiefly to mean the rational faculty, and since the universe, God, is for him rational, since our rationality is the divine spark in us, then yeah, he can use that as a synonym as well.
Now, it's such an interesting book, and just for those listening, the footnotes in this translation are excellent, and I highly recommend it. I just flipping through learned a lot of things and put ideas together. Like I've heard about Marcus, being on, being hooked on opium, for example, or, but you mentioned how he was I also relate to Marcus because he didn't like getting up in the morning, but it may have been brought on by the opium. But you have footnotes that help to explain all of that and what Galen had to say about it, etc. It's just so, it's such a handy thing to have these tidbits at the bottom of the page to help flesh out what's going on.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed writing them, so that comes across, I hope.
Are there any other books like the Meditations that from ancient times? Do we have anything else like this at all?
There's no book like it anywhere, frankly. It's completely unique. There's no other book in which anybody reflects at this kind of length, encourages himself or herself at this kind of length. There are more recent books which are roughly equivalent. Kierkegaard's notebooks are a bit alike. Lord Shaftesbury's notebooks are a bit alike. In fact, some of Lord Shaftesbury's stuff is really quite Marcusy, quite Markan, perhaps I should say. But no, it's a unique book, and that's why it's so great. I've also translated Epictetus, and that's completely different. It's much longer, for one thing. He's a teacher, he's a professional teacher, so he's addressing his students or his visitors. When Epictetus says you, It's always an external person that he's trying to correct or get to change their mind in some way or persuade of something. When Marcus says you, it is always him, always himself. He doesn't try to get you, me, to change my life. He only wants to affect his life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a charming aspect of the book. So it turns out to be a happy accident that when we read the book and he says you must bloody blah, we read the you as ourselves.
Right.
That's just a happy accident, because that wasn't his intention in the first place. He was only addressing himself, but we can take it too.
It's interesting in that I can't recall where, but I read that when journaling, if you take yourself out of it slightly by addressing yourself that way, you should do this or this should be done, it can actually help you to act on what you're writing about or reflect on it in a different way than if you say, I need to do this. And it's just interesting. It's a technique to distance yourself maybe from it slightly, but
yeah, that sounds like it makes sense. Yeah.
But so it's just it's a very powerful book. It's obviously influenced individuals throughout time. I think you even mentioned it said that Bill Clinton was a fan, for example. I've heard, it's just interesting who has been influenced by this text. But I think what I like about your translation also, I mean, there are other modern English translations, but it's so nice to read a book that flows well. On the podcast, I always read public domain versions of books when I'm doing readings because I don't like being sued. But it's so nice to step away from the 1800s translations and read a modern one. And on that note, do you have any passages that you would say are some of your favorites that you'd like to share with the listening audience?
It's a hard one because I like it all, really. Can I read a little bit out?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. This is one sentence that I particularly like, and I like it for two reasons. Firstly, because it's a good summary of Stoicism, or Stoicism as Marcus saw it. It covers quite a lot of ground. And secondly, because it is a very long sentence, but it's really elegant. And it shows what a good writer Marcus could be. Sometimes he was writing, as I said, just notes to himself in a very compressed way. But sometimes he wrote really well. And you have to be a good writer to write the sentence I'm going to read out. You have to be able to, have to be in control of your material. So this is from book 12, notebook 3. A long and I think supremely elegant sentence. It follows that if you separate from yourself, that is, from your mind, all that other people do or say, all that you yourself have done or said, all that disturbs your peace of mind as looming in the future, all the properties of the body that encases you or of the spirit that is embedded in it that are not subject to your volition, and all that swirls around you, driven by the whirlwind of the external world, until your mind has been released from the bonds of fate and lives purified, untrammeled, on its own, doing what is right, willingly accepting everything that happens and speaking the truth. If, I say, you detach your command center from what has become attached to it as a result of its being attracted by bodily feelings, and from all that is to come and all that has gone, and make yourself, in Empedocles' words, a rounded sphere, rejoicing in encircling solitude, and train yourself to live the only life you have, that is the present moment, you'll be able to pass what remains of your life up until your death with a mind that is tranquil in itself, kind to others, and at peace with your guardian spirit. I think that's wonderful. It's wonderful philosophy. It's wonderful writing. So, if I had to pick one sentence, that would probably be it.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you. Robin, do you have any other works that you're delving into now that you can talk about?
Well, Epictetus will be out next year from University of Chicago Press. I'm writing a biography of Plato at the moment for Oxford University Press. More or less simultaneously with Marcus, a history book came out called The Making of a King, Antigonus Gonatas of Macedon and the Greeks, because I do history as well. In fact, for the last 20 years, I've done more history than philosophy. It's only in the last couple of years that I've returned to philosophy again, which has been refreshing and fun.
Well, I greatly appreciate you joining the podcast this week. I'm sure the listeners will enjoy it. I will put a link to the text where they can check out the text in the show description. Is there any parting words you wish to leave us with before we go?
No, I just thank you for the opportunity, Steve. That was great.
Well, thank you, Robin. And as I end all of my episodes, seize the day, carpe diem.
Carpe diem.
Thank you for listening to the Sunday Stoic. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review the Sunday Stoic on iTunes. Become a member of the Sunday Stoic team, earn rewards, and be an integral part of the show by becoming a patron at www.patreon.com/SundayStoic. Contact the show by emailing sundaystoic@gmail.com or by leaving a voicemail at 501-503-3132. To find out more, visit www.sundaystoicpodcast.com. And as Steve always says, carpe diem.